All right, everyone. Welcome to this week's ITS seminar. I am really pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Stephen Wong, who comes to us from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, where he is an assistant professor and leads the Resilient and Sustainable Mobility and Evacuation Group, otherwise known as RESUME. What a great acronym.
I know, it worked out well.
Yeah. Several of us got to know Stephen here when he was a PhD student at UC Berkeley down the road in civil and environmental engineering there, working with Joan Walker and Susan Shaheen. And of course, his work overlaps with Miguel Hayer's work, and he's got some interest in cycling, so he's worked with Dylan, and figured it was time to get him here to share some of his work and get him out of the cold, snowy north Canada and back to California. So really looking forward to hearing his work about resilience hubs and some of the innovative things he's doing there. So please join me in welcoming Stephen.
All right, thanks everyone. Oh, this is so exciting. I'm really excited about this. It's a little bit of a homecoming, as Susan mentioned. Being at Berkeley, I wasn't too far away from Davis, but I distinctly remember a few times did a few century bike rides from Berkeley to Davis, and I always enjoyed hanging out in Davis downtown after the long bike ride and then training back home. So there's a soft place in my heart for Davis, so I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to be talking a little bit about resilience hubs. Who's heard of resilience hubs before? Anyone? Okay, we got like 2. Excellent. So this will be informative, and that's kind of the point of the research. I often go after really interesting ideas and things that no one's really talking about, and I try to apply methods that are a little bit traditional within engineering and planning, but I'm really interested in using human-centered methodologies and thinking through that. So I'm going to be presenting a little bit on this. Let's see if this works. There we go. The team, I put this slide first because I really want to highlight the incredible work that my graduate students have done on this, specifically Tayani Sirico and Veronica Wembura. I'm really kind of the messenger here of their just fantastic work, and I have to give a shout out to that. Also, Sarah Wong, who is an undergraduate research assistant, also assisted in some of this and was actually an author on a paper that was recently published. So really excited about that. And then Dr. Kareem El-Bastoni was a co-PI on this and has just provided wonderful mentorship and support on this grant. And the grant was funded by the City of Edmonton, as well as Alberta Eco Trust Foundation and MyTax. So if you noticed, we're talking very local city and somewhat local, Alberta being the province. So if you'll notice from the presentation, we're very much interested in the applied aspects of the research. So the goal of the project was not to create new methodologies from scratch or new theories. It was really about taking something that the City of Edmonton was considering, resilience hubs, and applying it into practice. So I'm going to talk first about the resilience hub concept more briefly to get everyone up to speed. I'm going to talk a little bit about the results that came out of this. I'm trying to really bring that to the forefront. And then finally, a little bit on a policy matrix and some future ongoing research. I'm also happy to answer any questions as they arise, so please raise your hand, and I will be happy to answer it. And then we can also chat a lot about the ongoing research if you have questions related to that as well. It doesn't have to be Resilience Hub question related. So, all right. This is, it's hard to tell, but this is a picture of Sacramento. And it is, if you can't really tell, but it's a very smoky day. And so there's an ongoing need for climate resilient and climate adaptive strategies, both within the transportation field and outside the transportation field, which is where we're getting to this idea of resilience hubs. Now, what are some of the issues that we're coming across? Well, we have a series of large-scale disasters that are impacting our communities, our cities, and our society. And we're seeing, for example, a higher intensity of some of these different types of events, such as rainfall, heat waves, droughts, and then a lot of it ends up producing wildfires. There's at the same time an increasing land development and populations in high-risk areas. People want to move to really nice places, and it turns out those really nice places either are on the coast for hurricanes or in really pretty places in the Sierra Nevadas, which is where very fire prone. It's hard, again, are we able to dim the lights in the front?
Well, that's a good question.
It's hard to see.
I know. Wait, oh, here we go. Presentation.
Ah, excellent.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay. So this is a fire, the McDougal Creek Fire in British Columbia. This is an area called Kelowna. Has anyone heard of Kelowna or been there? Nope. So Kelowna is actually a pretty decent wine region. You can kind of consider it like the Napa of Canada, and it has nice summers, has really good wine, but it's also, as a result, very fire prone because of the fuels that happen to be there. And so people want to live there. However, there's really high risk that comes with living there due to fires. And this all ends up leading to a potential for significant losses, whether that be from a human standpoint or economic losses. And we need to start addressing this, especially given that there's a likelihood that this is going to rise with increasing climate change. So when it comes to the transportation aspect, we have to deal with this head on. And when it comes to disasters, there's generally two aspects that we think about. The first one being we need to get people out. That's going to be the evacuation point. So we need to get people out, and transportation facilitates that. At the same time, we need to get goods in and resources into a place to be able to recover better as we deal with that disaster. And that's, again, well, not what Miguel does here at UC Davis. So I'm more on the people side. I'm trying to get people out or to a place that is better for them. But if you, and when it comes to these evacuations, they can be quite large. So hurricane evacuations can be millions of people. So some of these evacuations end up being, for example, Hurricane Irma was 6 million people. So that basically be about evacuating, what, half of the Bay Area all at once, or you can consider multiple Sacramentos over and over. And that's the scale that we're trying to get people out of the way of some of these hazards. There's also massive evacuations for wildfires. This one's up in Alberta. This was the scene from that fire back in 2016. It ended up being the worst fire and the worst disaster in Canadian history at the time. And it was very terrifying. You can see the congestion that arises from that, as well as the fire right along the roadways. We also see about 1 million people were ordered to evacuate from California wildfires between 2017 and 2019. So this is kind of a problem in a lot of different areas. So what does this necessitate? Well, we need new tools and different ways to either evacuate people or to encourage just people to not just survive, but also thrive within their environment. And there's a lot of key issues that arise when it comes to evacuation, some of which I found in my own dissertation work. The key one being evacuating people safely from different risks. There's 3 components of that. It's how do you get people out when you give them an evacuation order. That's considered compliance. People don't always comply with evacuation orders, which presents an issue. There's the congestion piece, which you saw in that past slide on the traffic that occurs from there. And then there's an equity piece, where people who do not have access to certain transportation and sheltering resources may be less likely or less willing or able to be able to evacuate. And this creates a big gap and discrepancy between what you are able in terms of what you're able to evacuate and who is able to evacuate. So that presents a challenge in of itself. At the same time, we're having challenges with finding and operating livable shelters. So evacuation shelters, if you think evacuation shelter, you probably don't think very positively about it. You think of something kind of cramped, very loud, very busy. It's not really that a great place to really thrive. And so there's a big challenge with that as well. The third one is connecting resources and survivors together. So a lot of times, how do survivors get certain types of resources, whether that be information, whether that be basic food and water, or other types of resources available to them. And finally, there's an aspect that I don't want to miss out here, is that we have a unique opportunity here where you can also be providing assistance and services to people on a regular basis. So I don't want to assume here that resilience is the primary goal that we have necessarily in all cases when it comes to transportation or any parts of society. So the idea behind a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is how can we provide resources to people on an everyday, ongoing, year-round basis, but is also able to ramp up in the event of a disaster. So this leads to the concept of resilience hubs. All of this combined leads to this. And the idea behind these is that they are capable to operate under both normal everyday conditions as well as disasters. There's kind of a twofold component to them. And they are really community-serving physical spaces created to support residents, communicate coordination and services, and provide resource distribution before, during, and after a disaster. So it seems pretty general. It's kind of open to interpretation. And for example, what does coordinate communication mean? The idea is more just an abstract concept or a vision of what a place could be and its goals. So the specifics of the services are going to have to be determined by the community, and that's where I'm going to get into that in the research. There are 3 different function modes for resilience hubs. This is a picture from Vibrant Hawaii, and I will use them as an example. So there's a number of resilience hubs in Hawaii, and they really came to be in existence as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. They serve 2 key functions during the response or disruption mode. The first is that they provided distance learning and Wi-Fi to students who didn't have access to internet at home. Because all of that schooling was now done online, but if you didn't have an internet connection, it presented a big challenge. And so these resilience hubs were really beneficial in that. The second one, as you can see in the picture, was providing food. That was a big aspect, food pantries, hot food, different aspects when it came to that. And so those were really the key areas in which they were acting in this response mode. Over time, they've now transitioned into a little bit more of a recovery mode, just trying to provide some of those still services on a more as-needed basis. And now they're kind of in the process, and they're still trying to figure it out on what they want to look like in an everyday or normal mode. Do they want to be continuing some of these services, but maybe in a lesser capacity? Do they want to switch directions in what resources they provide? But in reality, these resilience hubs are meant to do all 3 at different points of time. So there's a few research objectives that came out of this based on what we were seeing, the opportunities for resilience hubs. The first one is we needed to just identify what they were, which is kind of what I presented. We didn't have a good grasp of this because, as it turns out, transportation and resilience hubs have never overlapped at any point. And so most resilience hub work has been largely centered in a little bit more of an urban planning, but more even a community planning standpoint. So transportation has largely been left out of the equation of that. So we're interested in the research gaps, the limitations, but what strategies could they be, particularly as it pertains to transportation. The second was we wanted to address some of these by conducting an empirical analysis by looking at people's needs and their behaviors and these opportunities. And we were interested in understanding the development of resilience hub plans and transportation to and from. Because remember, we didn't really know much about are people going to travel to these places. Because a resilience hub is only going to be as good as if you can get people to go to that place. Otherwise, it's just sitting there. It just happens to be a place. But in the end, you need to get either people to and from there or resources to and from that location. And then the last objective, and this is where the applied aspect comes into the research, is that we are interested in providing decision support based on the empirical evidence. And this was a really key component for the city of Edmonton. They wanted an actual tool to be able to use. And so I think I'm talking to the right crowd as I talk about this on how to translate research into policy and actual action. And so you'll see a lot of these methods are very traditional, very common things that we use, but we wanted to all, in the end, feed to this decision support for the city. This is a picture from City of Edmonton in terms of the smoke there too. So we also have challenges as well when it comes to wildfire smoke. We had 2 different human-centered methodologies. The first one, very basic, was a survey. We got about 950 responses, which is actually not bad, pretty good. And it was both a convenience sample, which we sent out across different aspects the city helped kind of advertise in different ways. And then we also had a small panel sample that came from a general population distribution of the city that was done through a marketing company. It included both questions on resilience hubs as well as urban evacuation topics. I'm not going to talk about the urban evacuation piece today, but there is aspects of the research that came out of that, so if you're interested, you're welcome to ask. The other part, which is a little unique from an engineering standpoint, was focus groups. So we realized in the survey that we were probably not going to do a great job at understanding the needs of the people who might actually benefit the most from a resilience hub, specifically underserved populations that might not have access to basic services, food, water, or who might need these resources more in the event of a disaster. So we conducted 8 different groups. This was the list of the different groups. Interesting, we also conducted ones with recent immigrants, because Edmonton has a very high immigrant population, as well as parents and guardians of children. That was also really important for us. There's a pretty high number of families with children in the Edmonton area. And we conducted a series of data analyses. A few ones were kind of your typical ones from the survey. We did a descriptive statistics, and we created a number of binary and multinomial logit models for discrete choice analysis to try to understand the influencers of choice. And then at the same time, we're also interested in what information could we get out of the focus groups. So has anyone done content analysis before? Yeah, excellent. So one of the things that we did with the transcripts of the focus groups is we took them and we inserted them into this program called MaxQDA, and we devised a code book in which we said, well, here are some basic topics that we're interested in. And these codes are helpful because it allows us to highlight these pieces of text and to say, well, that piece of text, they're talking about the reliability of transit to a resilience hub. And that's a theme that we're interested in. And we can keep doing this across all the different transcripts, all the different focus groups. And at the end, we get a distribution of all these codes and themes that come up. So there might be situations where that reliability of transit is a code that keeps coming up over and over and over again. It's a theme, and we can grab key quotes out of that, and we can grab a little bit of quantitative information out of it. So it can actually be a really kind of a systematic way to understand people's needs and the storytelling as to why they made these decisions. Yes?
So does measure that is like, I mean, you just put the word in search option and it marks throughout the text, or it just like you have to do it manually?
We have to do it manually. So what you're describing, you could do some text mining behind that and use machine learning methods or other software packages. And MaxQDA has a few functions that actually allow for you to do keyword searching and things like that. For our case, though, we devised the code book to be done manually. So you do have to read through all the transcripts, and then you have to highlight individual texts yourself and code them. So it's kind of where the researcher comes in, but the code book allows the ability to make sure that you're following the same coding process. So sometimes if you really want to be super rigorous with it, you actually have 2 different people to code it, and you'll see how the codes align or don't align. In this case, we only did it once, but usually once is usually fine for this 8. But if you're doing it for like 30, 40 qualitative interviews, you usually probably want to have a second person to double check. Great question. Any other questions on the data analysis? Actually, that's a good place to pause. Or anything I've covered so far? Okay. I have to bring this slide up because I mentioned Edmonton a bunch. Where is Edmonton? So we're down here, Davis, right? And Edmonton is all the way up here. So we're very far up here. There is actually a direct flight from Edmonton to SFO that I'll be taking tomorrow, so that does exist. It is a very northern city. It's actually the northernmost city in North America with at least 1 million people in it. So it's quite far up there. It's also a decently sized city. So this is a picture of Edmonton. It's mostly surrounded by this large ring road. But what's a few kind of notes to mention is that you have this river valley that runs through. So it kind of separates the north and the south part of the city. And it follows kind of a little bit more of a traditional Midwest kind of style. Interestingly, whenever people ask, well, what US city is most like Edmonton, I actually usually say Sacramento. Just in terms of size, the feel, the vibe, I guess, overall. So you can kind of consider it as the Sacramento of Canada. But I just wanted to make sure that you knew kind of what our context was. That was super important. The other thing I'm going to mention a lot, and you'll be like, well, what is that? Is something called a community league. So we have these things in Edmonton called community leagues. Basically, every neighborhood has one. Think of it as a neighborhood association that is more based for like social reasons, not for maintaining HOA requirements. So it's a little bit more encouraging to some extent. And a lot of community building events and programming, also a lot of educational programming, recreation. For example, this is the community league for my neighborhood in Park Allen. So they actually have their own community hall that has about a capacity of about 100 people. It also has bathroom facilities and a kitchen in there. And then, of course, as typical for every Canadian community league, you must have an outdoor hockey rink. So in the winter, of course, this is flooded, and you have it's a nice hockey rink, and they even have lights. I mean, this is fancy stuff. So very classic Canadian. But I wanted to make sure I showed a picture so you got a sense on what a community league looks like. Yeah.
Is it publicly funded? Like the city owns the land, puts money into
Yes.
this?
Yeah. So it is publicly funded, and then as residents we pay dues, but the dues are usually like $40 a year. So it's
mandatory or
nope.
voluntary?
Voluntary. So it's quite nice. And usually people pay the dues just as kind of a nice thing to do to the community. It also gives you access to use the hockey rink, for example, which is not a bad thing to have. So you can go skating there and enjoy that time. We also happen in our...
Wait.
Oh, yeah.
What about curling?
They don't have curling here, but over here, see this bench? There's a whole wide section over here that's not a rink, but they also flood that, and you can use that for curling.
We have a faculty member who
Curls.
So
Well,
I had to ask
they would be very excited about this. We also happen to have a BMX pump track in our neighborhood, which is also very random. So, you know, there are random things in each one. Yeah, like you can, yeah. It's not bad. And some leagues have different things. Some have tennis courts. Some have, different aspects to them. But this happens to be ours. Any other questions about community leagues? They're kind of fun to think about.
That's a really cool concept.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's and I think it's also unique because it gives us the opportunity to have these resilience hubs, which you'll see moving forward. Okay.
How common are these throughout Canada, throughout Canadian cities?
Not very common.
Okay,
So it's an Edmonton thing. Yeah, it's a very distinctly Edmonton feature. I've not come across this really in any other place, though I haven't done a deep dive yet. Yes. Oh, do you have a question? No.
No, that's it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, just a bit of a context, because this is great. Shelter transportation for contingency, not only usual. It's really, really cold in Edmonton.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, also Quebec. So,
Yes.
why do you think it's different? Or why do you think that the idiosyncrasy of people to come up with this?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I would say it just happened. I don't know the history of the community leagues in Edmonton. Should probably learn about it. But I'm sure it came out through some policy decision by the city to say, well, let's try to improve social cohesion in neighborhoods, and maybe there was like kind of a grassroots effort. I mean, these aren't cheap, I guess, is the point. Like, these buildings aren't cheap, and to build all this infrastructure, it was like a deliberate effort that every neighborhood have one of these. Not every neighborhood ends up having a hall, but I would say 2/3 have a hall like this, and then all of them are a community, have at least a league that does stuff. So but I wouldn't know the difference as to why this ended up coming up here versus other places. Good question, I don't know. Yeah.
How vulnerable are they in terms of grid connectivity during a disaster, and do they have like a backup genset power source?
Yeah, so most are not ready for any type of emergency. So the answer is no, they are not resilient. And so, but that's the idea about this project, was to see what is the feasibility of some of these different places. Yeah, good question. I also, maybe I'll pause here in terms of the different hazards that we have in Edmonton. So the primary hazards are extreme cold, -40. So think about that. That is what? Fahrenheit, so that's 110 degrees colder than it is right now. Think about that for a second. It's very cold. We also do get extreme heat in the summer because we don't have air conditioning because it is so cold in many cases, so extreme heat can actually be a problem. We get a lot of smoke events from wildfires. Wildfires are particularly bad in the northern part of Canada, and the wildfire smoke comes in and hits us. There is decent fire risk. Grass fires in particular can come and hit the area, as well as flooding. And then we also have a little bit of a tornado risk. But overall, pretty climate resilient, overall. Yes?
When does the sun set in the summer?
10:30-ish. Like you can, I mean, even now it's like up. You have a lot of daylight, but then the winters get pretty rough. I mean, basically, I like go to work and it's dark out, and I come home from work and it's dark out, just like constantly. It's something else, different place for sure, but not a bad place to live. Not the worst.
Next time we invite you, it'll be January.
Yes, that'd be nice. Though it did snow 2 days ago in Edmonton, so you know, it happens. Any other questions before I move on to the results?
Just
Yeah.
quickly, do you all get any like smoke drift from United States, you know, like Oregon, California, when we ever have major weather? I just know how far it travels, or is it just local smoke issues?
It's usually local,
Yeah.
but we can get, particularly if something happens in British Columbia or Northwest Territories, we get that a lot of theirs because it goes west to east, so it comes through, right? So up here in BC, it often pushes across, just like how weather patterns happen in the United States. It's similar in Canada. But we haven't had many issues where Washington smoke has drifted too much into Alberta. Sometimes it does. It just depends on the wind patterns. But more recently, it's actually been our smoke in Canada affecting everywhere in the United States. Particularly a lot of cases last summer, there was a number of fires in Nova Scotia and Quebec, and a lot of that smoke came and hit New York City, Chicago, went all the way down to Georgia, and it was pretty bad. It was a rough summer for wildfire smoke. Yeah, great question. All right, now that we have the context, let's see some results. What do we get out of this? So what do we hear from residents? What do they want? What do they need? How can we better design resilience hubs to better meet that? So in terms of descriptive statistics, we asked, where would you like to have a hub? Straight up, just where would you like to have a hub? Are you satisfied with this location? So that's the blue. The purple, the next one is somewhat satisfied. And we see up here that community centers, in this case also that includes recreation centers, just a heads up. And lo and behold, the community leagues were quite popular as places. So we're talking in terms of satisfaction upwards of about 60 to 70%. That's pretty darn good for a place that we would want to locate some of these things. At the same time, schools and universities were quite high as well, also maintaining a pretty high up there. So again, pretty good options, as well as libraries. Libraries hold a pretty good standing as well. So people are generally satisfied with a lot of different places. But what I want to point out from this is that the key thing that all these places have in common is that people know them pretty well. You know usually your local school, you know where your local community center, you definitely know where your local community league is because it's in your neighborhood. So these are pretty well-known locations overall. We also asked people, are you likely to use a hub and across a variety of different kind of contexts? So the one at the top is normal conditions. Again, very likely is the blue, somewhat likely is this kind of purplish color. So we're talking about, what, 40% of people say they are very likely or somewhat likely to use it under normal conditions. So not great, think about in terms of a population. But once you look at disasters, people are like, oh, I would like to use that. That would be helpful for me. So we ended up asking the same question, and we looked at specifically evacuation shelter as a place to gather critical resources, to gather information. And we ended up finding it much, much higher, especially the information one. We had this almost at 70%. So people want to use these places to collect information specifically about the disaster and what's happening. It's really about awareness. And we thought that was actually quite surprising. We didn't realize information would be the highest one. We thought, oh, it must be something else, but information ended up being one of the higher ones. We also saw in terms of a place to volunteer, if people wanted to volunteer at these different hubs, yes.
So you must have had a description of the hub
Yes,
that you gave them.
we did,
Yeah.
yes. So we described it in very similar terms as the slide that you saw, but gave a little bit more detail that it could be used under normal conditions and kind of gave a suggestion of the different things it could be.
Yeah.
Yes, so we did do that. But there were a few questions we did ask before we gave them the description. So that we were just trying to see like what do you think a hub should be?
Yeah.
We did that before we gave them the definition. Yeah. We also asked if people were willing to volunteer at these places, and in terms of relief efforts, a lot higher, which is pretty good, but under normal conditions, don't really want to volunteer as much. That's probably more consistent with regular volunteering patterns across a lot of different places from a community standpoint. And so I think that was just kind of an interesting result that came out of this. We also asked people, do you find these transportation services very, like what is your level of importance, ranking from 1 to 5, 5 being very important, 1 being not important at all. And in terms of the very or most important, we found that people really wanted a place that was accessible for individuals with disabilities, which it probably should be, given that it's code. Probably should have that. But the fact that they put that as the highest is a good sign, including above car parking. So not bad. But I did want to bring out the car parking aspect, is that Edmonton is an auto-centric city. About 80% of all trips are taken by car. 20%, which is actually a decent amount, are taken by other modes of transportation, mostly walking and public transit, but we have about a 2% bike share, which is higher than you'd expect for a very cold city. But I bring that up because what ended up being high on people's list was actually transit connection. So that might be kind of opposite of what you'd expect from a car-centric city. One thing to note about, especially within Canada, is that public transit is often seen more as a key service to be provided, and that everyone will use public transit at some point in their life, and it's very useful for a broad amount of the population. And so being able to fund public transit is really important, and that's why we think this ended up being so high, is that even though they themselves, people wouldn't use it as a source to connect to public transit, that they would want to see that for other people as part of the Resilience Hub. In terms of walking distance, that was also really high, and wanting places that were really close by. Heated bus stops, there's the winter coming back in. You might be like, why would you want to have a heated bus stop? But you'll realize that when it's negative 40 out, you want something warm. And then the bike share, bike parking, much lower, but not nothing, right? This is not nothing. People still see value in this. And this is also in a place where people, again, are very auto-centric. And so it's interesting to see that people's priorities are still quite high for some of these other modes of transportation, even if they don't take it themselves. We also asked people, go ahead.
How about do electric vehicles function in winter?
Yeah, good question. So electric vehicles usually have a slight decrease, well, not a slight, a decent decrease in range. Anywhere from, if it's super cold, it could be as low as half of the battery range. Though in most cases, it's going to run you maybe about 25% reduction in range. The one thing we do have, actually, I remember the first time I went to Edmonton, I was very confused when I went to the parking lot. Because in the parking lot, all over the place, there's these like little stands that come out, like a little like pole, and they have plugs. I'm like, what is this? Like, is this for electric vehicle charging? This looks great. It's actually for people's block heaters. Because it gets so cold, there's a little block heater that you connect to your engine that is able to jump your vehicle because it's so cold. So more people use block heaters than electric vehicles, for sure. But I just wanted to throw that out there as an interesting tidbit of Edmonton. Electric vehicle usage is still quite low at this point. BC is much higher, though. Good question. Any other questions? Okay. So we asked people, where would you want to put a resilience hub in your community? Now, we didn't define community. We left it open to interpretation on what they thought their community should be. And then we also knew where their residence was. So we calculated the distance from their residence to that said resilience hub, and then we divided it by the mode of transportation, which is what you see here. So the people who are driving said on average they would want a resilience hub about 2 kilometers away from their residence, on average. Actually, that's on median, on median. Public transit, it was actually a little further, but notice that the walking folks, they wanted it like right next door. That's not too surprising, but we were like, wow, that was a big difference between the two. We also asked, what would be your mode under normal versus emergency? Note that this runs very similar to the mode share split of Edmonton. Pretty similar, 20% about trips auto-centric. But note that the walking is still quite high, specifically in emergency. We're still getting a decent amount of walk rate that people want to take to go to these hubs. So I think it's really, really interesting overall. The median distance ended up being 1.7 kilometers, which is about a mile. Okay, so we're talking about pretty close locations, about a mile away. So we also asked people, we asked about their location preference, but we divided it by a few of these key underserved populations that we're really interested in. And so this is divided across the underserved groups, so visible minority all the way to older adults. We have a variety of different ones in here. And we asked, where would you like to place, again, these hubs? So this is the same question as before. We're just dividing the data in a different way to see if there's any difference. Turns out that most people wanted in a community or rec center, but interestingly, the low-income households, as well as the older adults, would prefer it actually at a school. So there is slight differences among the different groups on what is the kind of priority. But as you note, a lot of these percentages are what? Between 60 and 80%. So they're all pretty, people still want them in all these different areas. Like they're all viable candidates. And I want to kind of clarify that there's not really overall a preference among them, but it is still important to note that there is kind of a generality that people want them in all of these different places. We also asked about the hub usage. Over to here's the overall survey. And if you look as a place to gather information, we have 73%. This one's lower, 66%, all the way up to 84%. But the average was about 70% across the whole sample. So we're seeing that underserved populations are more willing to go to these resilience hubs to gather information than our total sample overall. Yes?
What does visible minorities mean?
Yes, so visible minority in Canada is similar to ethnic and racial minority in the United States. Yeah. Though that, interestingly, that designation does not include First Nations, Métis, or Inuit populations. They're separate, they're a separate group. Yeah, very good question. Yeah, that's like Canadian versus US terminology, which does exist. In terms of as their second choice, a lot of temporary shelters along here, as well as critical place to gather critical resources. But note that, again, these numbers are higher than that of the overall. One next step is to actually run statistical analyses on this to really see if there is a significant difference or not. But just from a descriptive standpoint, we are seeing that, yeah.
So that's very interesting. So the Inuit and First Nations would fall in which of the...
Oh, I didn't, not in any of these in particular that I have. But I can run those if you'd like me to.
No, so you did survey them. The results are not.
No, I didn't have the results up here. I only had so many rows I could do. You could keep going on with more different vulnerable groups, but
there were less people.
No, we had enough, but these were the groups that we also happened to focus group. So that's why I'm presenting these ones. Yeah.
The last one. So that's like this research design choice. Why would you not include them?
In terms of which? In the focus group or in the?
Both.
So focus group we didn't, well, the focus group we didn't, when we started the research, it was not classified as Indigenous research. So actually we couldn't within the ethics protocol. Because it's they have special protection, and as part of reconciliation, aspects of how you conduct research with Indigenous populations has to be very specific. And so our original ethics protocol didn't include that, and we had to move with the project quicker. Yeah.
So it's a different certification you need to work with them?
Yeah, and different ethics considerations, yes.
And it was for a time constraint you decided to move along without them?
Yeah, so we still can survey them, but we couldn't do a specific focus group. Correct.
The surveys didn't make it through because you wanted it to be...
Yes, yeah. I mean, I can do the data analysis, and we have that. We do have that. I just didn't show it on the slide.
Okay, yeah. Let's move on.
Yeah, yeah. So we also asked in terms of what were different types of their mode choice in terms of normal conditions as well as emergency conditions. And so their personal vehicle usage was still pretty high and pretty similar to that, but notice that older adults were a little bit lower, though still the highest one. But note that the next one ended up being walking was very high, especially for carless residents. We see walking rates as being quite high. If you remember that from the first one, we had about 12% walking rates, and now we're having somewhat higher walking rates. The older adults, it's a little slightly unclear just because our sample size is so low. We only have about 38, so it's a little hard to make sure, but again, we can run statistical analyses later on. But this is the descriptive statistics just looking at it. And then public transit was pretty popular for carless. You might be asking, why were some carless people saying they use a personal vehicle? Our hypothesis there is that they were using someone else's personal vehicle within the household or their neighbors, and they classified it as a personal vehicle as something that they have access to. Mode choice was also similar in emergency conditions, though personal vehicle usage usually did rise for the emergency condition, kind of similar to that of the overall population. So more personal vehicle usage in emergencies, though decent walking rates still just overall. Okay, any other questions about the descriptive statistics? Good questions. Anything else? Yes?
I guess I'm curious in terms of distribution of some of these groups.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can kind of point to on your initial map where I guess more of these are concentrated than others.
Let's see if I can. Oh no, I shouldn't have done that. Oh, I'm gonna go back.
Yeah, I'm just curious as to whether these groups have very similar, I guess, pattern to the United States, where a lot of these populations, underserved groups, are in proximity to some of the freeways or certain areas.
Yeah. So interesting thing about Edmonton is that it's actually a decently well, one, it's a very diverse city, but the second is that we don't have too much specific segregation based on key demographic indicators. There is some sections, I would say overall, for example, the lower income section of Edmonton tends to be in this kind of block up here overall. But in most cases, it's actually income is pretty spread around. So actually, at one point I had a class I was teaching a class, and they did a class project, and they ran a Gini coefficient. They did a Gini curve and coefficient, and they're like, oh, it's like pretty equal. I'm like, but is that because of where they're placed, or because Edmonton's income just happens to be very distributed? So it turns out that in a lot of cases, most demographics are pretty widely spread throughout Edmonton, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah.
And it's not always the case in every Canadian city, or obviously U.S. city, but is interesting. I do think there is a higher immigrant population in this section of the city, in Mill Woods, and a little bit higher up in here as well, in the northern part. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious, actually, what are the maybe demographic proportions of visible minorities and of First Nations in Edmonton?
So visible minorities runs,
It's fine.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I think we have about a 5 to 10% First Nation, Indigenous, Métis population. Visible minority is at least 20 to 30%.
Oh, wow.
It's a very high immigrant population.
Yeah, very high.
Great Asian food.
Sure.
It's fantastic. So I think that's also quite interesting as a city as well. It's a very immigrant-heavy city. A lot of country as well, and country as well. So, yes.
So yes, I lived in Calgary for a bit.
Oh, yeah.
That's why I'm familiar, and I did see Indigenous, and they were mostly in the street, homeless. And I left the program with sustainability because they were not including the Indigenous. Like the whole urban module of planning was done without them, even though it was assumed to be sacred lands. The role play was all agents, stakeholders, community residents, even tourism, but not them, because this is how they do things historically.
Yes.
So I saw like this is huge discrimination and racism like being taught in.
Yes.
So I was curious of how that subtly kind of keeps happening.
Yeah.
And the other question,
Well, that's a big question that I think we'll save for after the presentation.
How do you perceive it? Because it's usually like unconscious, or it's kind of hard to fight the system in a way because this is how things are done, and we just exclude them, for centuries. The second is you mentioned there are more EVs in BC, even though Alberta is the richest province.
Yes. I didn't say they were the richest province. There are more EVs in BC though. But I didn't.
Intuition and why?
Yeah, well, BC overall has more EV incentives overall, and Vancouver is actually quite a wealthy city as well, and and BC overall culturally is more oriented towards environmentalism. Alberta is an oil gas province.
Oil sands, they love them.
Yes. Interesting fun fact, though, about the University of Alberta is that we have one of the only standalone faculties of Native Studies in Canada. And we're doing a lot of important work in that area. And I have a colleague who specializes actually in working with Indigenous communities, specifically within the evacuation context. So I can point you to some of her work because she has developed decades-long partnerships with Indigenous communities. That's also another reason why me being kind of a new person to Canada, it's actually sometimes not the best for me to actually be engaging in that research, as people who have been there longer and who have established those connections and those partnerships are usually the people who should be continuing on in those partnerships. And it takes a long time to develop that, decades of work. Yeah, to develop situated knowledge and to insert it into research. So I want to clarify that part as well. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna have to.
You did invite questions.
I did. Okay, so where am I on time? Okay. All right, so I'm gonna do a pause on questions for a little bit, just so I can make sure I can get through the rest of the presentation, because I think it's still very helpful. So the next part of the presentation is about some of the behavioral modeling that we did. So this is a traditional behavioral model that you would probably see. It's a typical binary logit model where we looked at one binary as being somewhat or very likely to use the resilience hub as a temporary shelter. That's positive, versus not likely to use it. So that would be the negative. So any of these coefficients that are positive means that people are more likely to use that hub. Negative is less likely. So within this model, you can see that households with at least one child are more likely to use the hub as a temporary shelter. Visible minority, as well as individuals with disabilities, are more likely to. And then these two variables are actually really interesting. My neighbors would help me in an emergency, and a resilience hub would help increase social cohesion in my neighborhood. We would probably classify these as attitudinal variables, people's perceptions of the world and what they would want and attitudes. So you can think about this as that I'm, for example, someone who's environmental, therefore I bike, right? So that'd be like an attitude. In this case, I think that these things would actually be helpful for my community, and I would want to be working with my neighbors in order to have disaster relief, and so they're more likely to use them as a situation. So I think that's kind of a good, I guess, comparison to environmentalism and biking would be about this belief of social cohesion in disasters to using a resilience hub. So the overall findings, so I'm not going to present all the behavioral models because that's a lot, but it's in the paper, so it is available to you. And what I'm going to present here is just the high-level takeaways, just things that if you were to remember something from this, this would be useful for you. So the first is that trust and compassion variables had a positive impact on using a hub during a disaster. So elements of that social capital did usually increase willingness to use the hub. The second was, again, this variable, this attitude on helping increase social cohesion did increase rates. We were actually a little surprised on that. We didn't think it was going to matter, but we included it, and we found that it ended up being statistically significant. And then those who are part of community organizations were more likely to use a hub during normal conditions. Okay? Individuals employed full-time or part-time are less likely to use a hub. We weren't 100% sure as to why, perhaps because they might know people further out. They already have their resources available to them. They could also have certain types of work requirements that prevent them from using the hub. Individuals with disabilities are more likely to use a hub, and then other vulnerable or underserved groups are more willing to use a hub, but it is generally situational dependent. So it depends on what the usage case is. Is it normal? Is it not? It's very dependent. So there's not like a key takeaway to take across beyond individuals with disabilities overall for disasters. Okay. We also conducted some mode choice models. These are just the key takeaways. In the end, variables about how people would use a hub were largely insignificant. So it didn't matter if I was using it under normal versus not. Didn't really make too much of an impact. We kind of saw this in the descriptive statistics. They weren't too far away between normal and emergency. And so ended up being kind of more insignificant there. Of course, automobile ownership, as always shows itself up in mode choice models. And it ended up, of course, here, it impacted mode choice decisions, specifically personal vehicle. When you own more vehicles, you are more likely to take a personal vehicle. And then the demographic variables did have some mode-specific effects, but were usually different between normal and emergency conditions. So just kind of overall, nothing too clear in terms of mode choice. But it seems overall to be acting more similar to a regular mode choice model under normal conditions. So there's nothing necessarily special about resilience hubs that leads to different mode choice per se. But that's helpful because we didn't actually know beforehand. So the key takeaways of these survey results is clearly people like these things in well-known close locations. It's like the biggest key takeaway, which is actually important because the city of Edmonton, when we started working with them as partners and co-collaborators in the research and doing that co-designing of the research, they were like, we just want it in one place at the Expo Center, be pretty good. But interesting, the results are like, nope, that doesn't work very well because people do want them in a variety of different places. Accessibility was important for all the different groups, both the general population as well as a lot of the different underserved groups. And transit connections were also highlighted as a key feature among everyone, which is, again, interesting and higher than the actual public transit mode split. Underserved groups have a decently high walking rate, so multimodality will be really important and will be required. This type of multimodality planning will be necessary to make sure that we meet the needs of a lot of the underserved populations. And underserved populations would also use these hubs at a pretty high rate during a disaster. So the equitable outcomes could actually be even better in this case, since they are the ones using it. If we can use these as really key mechanisms for both relief distribution, but also for evacuations, this can be very beneficial. And then the social capital variables do affect hub usage as well, which is a little surprising. We weren't expecting it. We just threw it in the survey being like, maybe that'll be something. Turned out to be more than we thought. So we thought that was quite interesting and a little bit unexpected. Yeah?
This final line right here, social capital variables affect hub usage. To what extent affects the hub usage in day-to-day use?
Oh.
Or only in what, emergencies and such? And so you said it's a positive, so higher social capital in, okay.
Yeah, and I believe it was mostly under disaster conditions, not necessarily in normal.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll have to double check that though. Don't quote me. I have to look at my own paper to double check. If it was,
might have said both.
It might be both.
Yeah.
It might be both. Okay. So briefly about the focus groups. I have a few more, actually a number of slides to get through, so I'm going to try to get through them. So when it came to the focus groups, what down here is the code distribution, the total number of coded segments where people talked about the location. So think of coded segments as like numbers of times it was discussed. Okay? So the percentage indicates the percentage of all of the times that people talked about location, how often they talked about community leagues. This ended up being about 20% of the time people talked about community leagues. Now, does that mean that's the best place? No, but it's what ended up being discussed on a very common, it was a key theme. So community leagues were quite high, recreation centers. Worship centers popped up, which was a little bit different than the descriptive statistics. People had a lot of discussion about that on how, in past cases, faith organizations have been very helpful in disaster relief. And so they expected it to be kind of similar there, say, oh, well, the church is the center of my community, therefore that could be a good place for that. And within a lot of these different coding segments, people, again, talked a lot about centrally located places, well-known places, places that would be spacious. Especially for childcare. That was actually an interesting one, especially for the group who were parents or guardians of children. And had the presence of just a variety of amenities. In terms of those features and amenities and services, people talked a lot about having close to neighbors and residences, even more so than basic needs. People were like, I just want it close to me. And they just kept bringing this up. We didn't ask them to say this, by the way. We just asked them, what would you like in a resilience hub? And they're like, well, I want it close. That was like usually people's first response. Accessibility in terms of ease of reach, as well as accessibility. This is access and functional needs populations, which is actually a California term, for a lot of different underserved and vulnerable populations in a disaster. That was also very important. Spaces for children came up a lot for that same group of parents and guardians of children. And you can see as it kind of keeps going down, there was still a lot of discussion on some of these other codes. Remember, this is out of 385 coded segments, so 4% of that is still like a decent amount of discussion on a lot of these. In terms of transportation mode to resilience hub, people talked about public transit a lot, as well as walking, not as much on the driving side. We also had a decent amount who talked about it depends. So it depends on the hazard, it depends on the situation, it depends on if I have access to my vehicle that day. It depends on if the bus shows up. A lot of these kind of it depends, so it's some interesting discussion about that. And though at the same time, what this does is it doesn't show it across the different groups, but when you differentiate it among the different groups that we happened to interview, we ended up having public transit, older adults talk about that a lot, as well as households with children, and recent immigrants talked about public transit a lot. Carless populations talked about walking, while households with children also talked about driving. So it wasn't consistent, I guess. This masks the fact that each of the focus group talked about different things. And it became kind of an ongoing discussion within them in terms of what they needed. We also just asked them straight up, just raise a hand, what would you use? And interestingly, this ended up mirroring very closely to that of the coded segments. So public transit, 40%, walking, 28%. We had an it depends as well. Drive ended up being 20%. And on emergency conditions, pretty much the same situation. Though a slightly higher it depends kind of situation. Note that the other modes are quite small down here on the other end. We also had people discuss a lot of different other things, like the paratransit services. There was a very long discussion, I forget actually in which group, but they talked a lot about free public transit. They were very concerned about that. And so that came up as a key theme for that specific group. Also, a little bit of active transportation infrastructure. Parking, of course, always your controversial topic. And again, here your heated bus shelters again. So people really wanted those heated bus shelters as kind of an aspect of these hubs. So in the end, the policy recommendations that specifically came out of the focus groups were quite similar to that of the survey. And we, again, weren't expecting how closely they would necessarily be aligned themselves with. But in the end, people said, well, they should be centrally located. They should be well-known, easily accessible in a variety of different ways, especially for people with disabilities. And so these ended up mirroring a lot of the descriptive statistics that kind of came out, and we were a little surprised by that, on how closely it was discussed. But there were also a lot of additional changes that people suggested in terms of infrastructure. We actually asked them what types of infrastructure would you like to see improved as part of this. And again, those heated bus shelters came up. Even though this wasn't infrastructure, they did talk about transit frequency in terms of operations. They said this has to be a priority. And then wider sidewalks came up also in a few of the discussions as well. Okay. So with the focus groups done, I want to briefly talk about the accessibility analysis and then finally end with the policy. So we conducted an accessibility analysis where we took some of these key locations and we looked at these isochrones on how much time it would take to get to and from these locations. This is a little hard to tell because it is what it is. But we can see here, these are all the little community league halls across Edmonton. So you can see there's a ton of these little community league halls. The yellow is walking. The orange, which is very hard to see, is public transit off-peak. Purple is transit peak. And the green, which is, again, hard to tell, that's bicycling. Bicycling ended up being on a level 2 facility or better. So mostly key biking infrastructure, not just like a road per se. So you can see with community leagues, pretty good coverage, though transit not great because we're talking about 15 minutes. So transit also includes walking to the bus stop, waiting for the bus to come, and then getting on the bus. So there was kind of those aspects. But what I wanted to note specifically from here compared to the next one, when I just do recreation centers, right? So we don't have that many recreation centers in Edmonton. I mean, we have 1 million people, we don't have that many. And so we can see this coverage starts to drop, but you can also see how much the biking infrastructure is actually pretty helpful for us. Though, remember from the mode split, people aren't biking, so that's also a key challenge in and of itself. We also did it for libraries, and we see a pretty similar pattern there as well. Not as many libraries, as well as not getting as much coverage. But what I did want to also show is what does it look like if you do a 30-minute accessibility, and now we start seeing something interesting. So again, this is yellow is walking, orange is public transit off-peak, purple is public transit peak, and we start to see a lot of the sections of the city, especially with libraries, end up being covered. You might be saying, well, there are some gaps, like right up here, right? That's mostly industrial. Actually, it's all industrial. So no real need for a resilience hub per se. There's also a lot of industry over here. But one key area of the city that is not really covered is down here. This is kind of new suburban residential area, as well as some down here as well. So there are gaps within Edmonton still. If I was to look at this from a 15-minute versus 30% on what percentage of the Edmonton population is covered, for Community League Library Recreation Center, up, of course, you can see car for all three it's very high. Turns out you can go everywhere in Edmonton in 25 minutes and there's no traffic. It's pretty nice. It's very easy to drive everywhere, hence why it's auto-centric. Unsurprising there. But we do see that once we get to this 30-minute side that our bike share, our public transit peak coverage ends up increasing a decent amount. But if you look at all the community leagues, they can do a pretty good job. But what is the key limitation of these community leagues? Capacity. We don't have as much capacity in these halls, and they don't have as much functionality or basic services as a recreation center or as a library. So that's going to be the next step, is to kind of weight this by capacity, look at what is actually available, and kind of go from there. So the key takeaways from this very brief accessibility analysis is that we do get moderate but similar coverage for recreation centers for libraries. This does increase for 30 minutes, which is not bad considering how spread out Edmonton is. We also see a pretty high coverage of community leagues overall, which is good, and high access for private vehicles. So if you have a car, you're probably going to be fine, but that's not really kind of the point of a resilience hub. It's to provide resources for the entire population. Decent strong bike performance compared to public transit overall as well. So decent bike infrastructure. We actually we're investing $100 million in bike infrastructure over the next few years in Edmonton, which actually might be one of the highest amounts of dedicated biking funds in North America. So they actually really are trying to make a difference. All right. So in terms of the policy and future work, so what we did with all of this information is the city was like, well, this is all great, but can we get something useful for us? And so, okay, we can try. We'll do our best. So what we did is we created a matrix, a policy matrix, with 12 primary criteria and 30 sub-criteria that were based on the research. So some of these criteria I'm going to show you on the next slide, but we were able to rank these criteria on a rating scale from 0 to 5. And we had these different descriptions for the different levels and some type of minimum score. So what we're just doing here is we're creating a scorecard, right? So that we can compare Resilience Hub A, possible placement, to Resilience Hub B, possible placement. And our goal with this was to really emphasize transportation, because transportation has mostly been de-emphasized as part of the Resilience Hub design. And so the total score does allow for a comparison. So I can compare, for example, the Meadows Recreation Center to one of the main libraries in the system. And I can see which one would be a better choice based on some of these metrics. So the criteria, I'm not going to go through all these too much, but this is just for just your understanding. We had some like distance from residence, public transit connections, active transportation connections. We also had some on vulnerability, as well as the type of place. So some of these different kind of categories we had. Is there parking available, for example, because that is still important for a lot of people. And some other aspects like basic services, emergency training, heating and cooling systems, emergency services. So this was quite comprehensive. We wanted it to be pretty comprehensive. So what does an example of one of these criteria look like? Well, this was a number of stops criteria. So a 5 would be considered there is at least one public transit stop next to the Resilience Hub or within 0.2 kilometers of the Resilience Hub. So basically next door. But a 0 would be there's nothing within 1 kilometer. Again, we wanted to make this a really challenging scorecard. Like this would actually kind of be hard to achieve because we really wanted to differentiate what were our top performers versus our not top performers. We also developed this entire framework as part of a workshop and webinars with the city. So they were in constant contact on what would be good criteria, what would be useful for them, and also some of these descriptions as well. We also had a high-frequency service criteria as another example, so 15 minutes or less for bus or train services during peak hours. We have a pretty good transit service in Edmonton, so this is considered actually quite good. I know Davis has pretty good transit service as well, pretty high frequency, but in most Midwest cities overall, both in Canada and the United States, usually transit is not prioritized, so this is considered quite good. And 0, you don't have any bus or train service, but note that there's a minimum of at least 1, so you need to have at least some service. Otherwise, it's not going to be classified. It's not going to be scored well. We do have the matrix available. It's part of a policy brief as well as a report. So if you're interested, it is available, and I can also share a link with you if you would like to as well. But we did just finish developing this. I just actually submitted our final report today. So this is like the end of the project. So really excited about that, and the city was really happy with the outcome of it. The other thing I wanted to note out of this is that California actually has its own process going on. Did anyone know about this? Aha, yes, excellent. So we have something in California. The Strategic Growth Council is developed a Community Resilience Centers program, and they actually have a lot of funding for this thing. We have $110 million for round 1 and $75 million for round 2. This is just recent policy that kind of came out in the last few years. And the idea is that it funds new construction and upgrades to existing buildings. They call it community resilience centers. It's the same thing. It's a resilience hub. They use this. It's just a slightly different language. Probably something legislative. I'm not exactly sure, but I'm sure at some point it came through. There is a possible evaluation of program outcomes, but they, I believe, are just at this point about to tell everyone if they won or not. Because I believe it was April 2024 was when they were going to say who won the money. So once that we figure out who wins the money, then we can start to figure out what are the metrics for program outcomes and evaluation if it starts to actually increase community resilience. So there's good news in California. You're doing a good job. And actually, interestingly, some of my conversations, I had conversations with the Strategic Growth Council, and we used some of our own research to guide them in the program descriptions. So another example of kind of that research translation, that policy translation as well. Just a little bit of additional resources if you want to know. I have a slide on just all of the different publications we've provided, and some of it's ongoing. Some of them are working papers. So if you're interested, let me know. And I also want to throw this slide up in case people are interested as well. We can have a brief discussion. Also, I can stay a little later if you'd like me to, if you want to talk about this in more depth. But just some of the things that we're doing here at the Resume group. Of course, my entire presentation was on this part, the Resilience Hub Design Analysis. But we're also thinking about wildfire evacuations and intentions. That was a lot of my PhD work. I'm continuing it on into the Canadian context. I had the great question about electric vehicles. We are looking at the resilience of these things and if how people are going to charge them in disasters. Are they going to overload our grid? Likely. Could be a big problem, especially if we have outages. That really starts to really compound as a key disaster. Micromobility in disasters and emergencies, which is some of the work I've done here at Davis alongside Dylan, which is really exciting to be able to do that. And then we're also looking a little bit more about travel behavior and smoke events. So trying to connect transportation and smoke and also the resilience hub concept as well. So just a little smattering of some of the research that we're doing up here up in Edmonton. So with that, I want to thank everyone for having me here. Our team is really thankful that we got the wonderful invitation and I got to be the messenger of this work. But I hope this was at least somewhat interesting and I think shows that even within the engineering space, we can use a variety of different methods to really answer key questions and try to provide key decision support to our policymakers, and I think that's where the value of the work kind of comes into play. We didn't use new theories necessarily or new methodologies. We used what we had available in our toolkit, but we made it useful for the city, and it worked out quite well. So with that, thank you so much, and I'll have to take more questions. Yes?
Towards the end, you had two slides.
Yeah.
I think it was showing the percentage of, I guess, the transportation mode folks would use during normal conditions.
Yeah.
I think one of them was like 40 versus 3/4 for public transit. Is that correct? I don't know if that was the slide I was looking at.
Yeah.
I was just surprised of how high that number was. So I'm curious.
Within the focus groups.
Within the focus groups. Yeah. So I'm just curious about what is it about your current public transit system that is showing that high of a percentage. Maybe it's just a.
What's the transit share?
Transit share is about
Overall.
10%. Overall transit mode is about 10%. A few things that came up is, well, one, that transit was their only option within the focus group. But interestingly, there was a decent and not zero discussion about how some people would actually prefer to be on public transit because they'd be surrounded by people. They actually preferred to be around people, potentially people who could help them. And we were a little surprised by that. We were like, oh, that's an interesting part of the discussion. Like, I would never think that. And so that became an interesting kind of note, which is probably why it ended up being discussed a lot more. And I think the people who were taking public transit were very vocal about it also in the focus groups, being like they were very concerned in a disaster, how can they get out? They're very concerned about bus frequency, are the buses running, are the bus drivers available? There's a big discussion about that as well. But as a note is that just kind of in general, Canadian public transit usually punches above the weight in a way. They do pretty well and they're really meant to be key services, and they're usually funded as such. They're usually funded at higher levels. Actually, Calgary has the highest I believe it has the highest light rail ridership, according to APTA, in all of North America for any light rail system. Calgary has a very ridden light rail system. I think next behind it is San Diego. And then there's like Toronto thrown in there, Portland is in there. But Calgary is very high on that list, but Calgary is about a 1.5 million person city area, so it's like they do pretty well for their transit services.
So kind of going on with that, where's a lot of the funding being allocated from, like, for public transit specifically?
Mostly from property tax from locals. We get very little support from the province. Province and local is an ongoing battle. Province is usually not too keen on transit. They're much more oriented towards highway development. Being Alberta, being oil gas. And there's often kind of, discussion about that. But on the federal side as well as the local side, there's a strong emphasis on transit. So that's, I think, a prioritization. And it's interesting because even a really remote bus terminal on the edge of a suburb will get far more ridership than places that you would ever expect to have ridership. I stood there one time for a research project, and hundreds and hundreds of people are coming through on a regular basis. And this is like very at the edge of the city, and it's because it's just a more common use of way to get around for all people. Yeah, good question. Thank you. Yeah.
So regarding the modeling, I missed the first part of your presentation. So how do you actually describe to the people about disaster? Like, is there any particular disaster? Because in my understanding, if it is any particular kind of disaster, there at least I would expect like some difference depending on the type of disaster. Like if it is flood, the mood is gonna be like completely different. But if it is any other disaster, then that would be completely different.
Very good question. So that kind of gets back to research design. So we ended up doing it hazard agnostic, or I guess you could consider all hazards, whichever way you want to think about it. The reason being is that Edmonton's hazards are not always, like, there's no like big one to be concerned about. Like there's not like a massive one, like a hurricane, right? Or like some places like Seattle is very concerned about an earthquake, or San Francisco is very concerned about an earthquake. So it's not like a dominating hazard. And a lot of the hazards that do exist in Edmonton probably wouldn't lead to too much mode change, just because they tend to be a little bit more disruption oriented rather than like an acute shock. The one concern I actually have is usually related to train derailment. So if anyone has remembered East Palestine, Ohio, really bad train derailment. In Quebec, there was a really bad train derailment as well a few years ago. That's probably my biggest concern for Edmonton, but no one's really talking about it. So just so you all know, that's my concern. But yeah, it ended up being hazard agnostic, but that is a good kind of direction, is to look to see generalizability, look at other communities that have different types of hazards and specifically asking these questions under that specific hazard type. So if it is a wildfire, what is the mode in a wildfire case versus like a smoke event? It might be the same. I don't know, but might not. Yeah.
When you were talking about the focus groups, you had them come up with, or they mentioned different priorities that they had for the resilience hubs.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it looked like the way that you scored them was by the amount of times that they brought those up.
Yeah.
Did you ever have them rate the criteria that they brought up and say, like, because you said it was kind of weird that basic needs was below.
Mm-hmm.
If it was just by mentioning, they might have just assumed that, oh, of course it's going to have basic needs. So did you check for that?
No, we didn't. That's a good point. That's a good idea. I think the challenging part is then, do we just need a survey on top of that, to survey those? And maybe that is a change to the methodology, is to add a short survey to try to make sure that that's differentiated. We didn't think about that as we kind of went into it, that it would be like this. Is ended up being kind of hindsight. But that's a very good point. So yeah, perhaps a short survey to help kind of differentiate among that could be very helpful. I didn't show it in here, but there was also a lot of quotes that came out of the interviews and the focus groups that were really helpful for us to kind of talk about, like these different kind of needs and features and whatnot. So yeah, good point. Yeah.
Yeah, so the finding about the social capital variables, very interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, it makes sense.
Mhm.
People who sort of believe in helping each other would see the value in this
Mhm.
and the value in using it.
Mhm.
But I guess I worry that then, you know, you've got like the virtuous cycle and then there's the other half, like people who are not such believers in
Social.
helping each
Yeah.
other, social capital. They might need it more.
That's
even,
true.
'cause are they less connected to their neighbors? And
That's true.
yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
That's tricky. I mean, I do think overall the moral of the story is we need different strategies to try to at least increase cohesion within communities, building that social capital, which there is a literature beyond disasters on just a regular basis how that can be beneficial for communities, but particularly within the disaster space, it is a very common kind of discussion. And it's really only been the last 10 years that it's really come to be so critical for especially recovery. So when you have that higher social capital, researchers have found that people recover, like the community recovers faster.
Yeah.
So that I think presents an interesting challenge, but if we can increase people's trust and compassion of each other, not only do you get people who are more willing to use the hub, but you might get just broader political willingness, and then you get also on top of that almost like a double benefit, just like how on the reverse you get kind of a double backslide.
Yeah.
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 So and
it's, yeah, like working with the skeptics.
yeah, it's gonna be tough.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because there is some work out of Florida that's looking at rural resilience hubs and libraries, and there's actually a pretty good interest in it. A lot of times, actually, rural communities end up being quite tight-knit in a lot of cases and have a lot of trust for each other, and so they often end up recovering decently well. But places where, yeah, you're having that challenge, I don't know. We're going to have to develop that. So my dissertation does look at, try to come up with strategies, though I don't know the best way to go do that.
And then just quickly, in California, we don't have community leagues.
Right.
So what kind of places is California thinking about? Schools?
I don't know.
Yeah.
The problem is with schools, I mean, the schools could work, but the problem is with schools is that if the disaster happens during the school year,
Yeah.
it then creates a conflict between providing for a disaster and trying to continue educational aspects. Like Tyani in the right over there, she talks all this time. She's like, oh yeah, like near my hometown, there was these massive mudslides, and everyone went to the school, but they haven't recovered. So people are still at the school, but it's like education time, like it's like school time. So now you have the public interfacing with kids at school, and so it's usually not a great combination. Yeah. But interesting also, just as a side note, that libraries today, especially in California, are being designed, especially with a lot of these considerations already kind of baked in, but they're not calling them necessarily resilience hubs, or they're not including the programming or services that go alongside. But they're thinking about like generators, solar panels, which also is a part of residential developments as well.
That's where we got our COVID tests. Go over to the public
there
library.
you go.
Giving them out for free.
A mini resilience hub. Yep. Yes.
I was based off that question right there. I was thinking, you can look at some of these. Like you could take Ukraine as an example for a long-term natural disaster,
right?
Through the weaponization of war, weaponization of winter, through extreme cold. But I would say that's a long-term disaster. It's not very common in that sense. Really, what we need to be focusing on, especially as the world warms, is blackouts, power outages during extreme heat waves. And so what's the average life? It's not a question to you, but in general, how long would that last? 3 days, a week, 2 weeks maximum? And during that period of time, are you going to be educating people during that period of time? No, you're probably not.
Probably not. No, I agree with you on that. But if you have something like Paradise, campfire, right? Yeah. So I think it depends on the hazard, which is then I think gets back to the point in the back, is it becomes hazard specific, and that's also why I think this type of work can be very beneficial for all different types of communities, and we might need to do this process. And that was kind of a point that we made in one of our papers, that we're saying, well, this is just looking at a mid-sized city in North America that's autocentric, that has mediocre, moderate hazards, right? So that's only a certain number of cities that are like that. So perhaps something more focused on a smaller case like Davis, or something larger like San Francisco, would have different hazard types, might lead to different results. And yeah, the power outage part is definitely critical. I mean, power switch shutoff events, even like deliberate power shutoffs, of course, you have now in California. I actually looked at that in a paper as well, looking at travel behavior, potential travel behavior during, no, actually real travel behavior in that. And so but that's the idea of the resilience hub, is that it's not just meant for just an earthquake, or not just meant just for wildfire. It's meant for major smoke events. It's a clean air center. It's meant to be a place that you can get cooling if it's extreme heat, to power up your cell phones if you need it. It's meant to be much more encompassing than like just a typical evacuation shelter where you just kind of go and that's kind of it. It's meant to be a little bit more trusted, a place you constantly know that's your kind of core. That's not let's say third place, I guess like your fourth place, right? The fourth place where if you need something, that's where you go. And then also the city officials also know that is the place you send goods and you get people to go there as well from the city and provide. It's kind of like both. So it's looking at kind of taking that evacuation shelter idea and broadening it, but then also providing elements of like mobility hubs as part of it, making sure that people can get to and from there. Because that's often not the case for evacuation shelters. They just usually pick a few schools that seem good, and that's usually how they do it.
Well, I think this is a very kind of hopeful way to end, that we're starting to think about this.
Yes.
The increasing need for the future, and
yes.
How can we make our communities more resilient.
Yes.
Thank you for working on this.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much.
Thank you.